It was December 1944, and the world was engulfed in the flames of World War II. The tides of the war had turned dramatically against Japan. After years of relentless expansion across East Asia and the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was now on the defensive. Allied forces, led by the United States, were advancing steadily, reclaiming islands one by one in their march towards Japan's mainland. In the Philippines, Japanese forces were crumbling under the pressure of relentless American air raids and naval bombardments. One by one, Japan's Pacific strongholds fell, and Japan's hopes of securing its wartime conquests were slipping away. Defeat seemed inevitable, yet for Japan's military, surrender was not an option. Orders from the highest ranks of the Japanese Imperial Army were clear: fight until the last man, no matter the cost. Amid this chaos, a young intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda was about to receive an assignment that would define the rest of his life. Onoda was trained in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. At just 22 years old, he was sent to a remote island in the Philippines, tasked with a nearly impossible mission: to hold Lubang Island against the advancing U.S. forces and resist any attempts to capture it. What Onoda didn't know was that this assignment would become a test of endurance beyond anything he could have imagined, lasting not months, but nearly 3 decades. Onoda's orders were strict. He was to sabotage any efforts by the Allies to take the island, destroy the airstrip and pier, and keep enemy forces from gaining a foothold. He was also given a clear instruction that would shape his actions for years to come. Under no circumstances are you to surrender. However, when Onoda arrived on Lubang, he found that the situation was already dire. Japanese forces on the island had been significantly weakened, and they lacked the resources to mount a serious defense. Onoda's superior officers on the island ignored his urgent pleas to destroy the airfield and pier, which could have delayed the inevitable U.S. invasion. Before long, the Americans landed on Lubang, easily overpowering the remaining Japanese soldiers. Within days, the island was captured, but Onoda and a small group of soldiers, determined to continue the fight, retreated into the dense, unforgiving jungle. Among them were 3 others: Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. They were isolated, cut off from any Japanese command, but their belief in the mission was unwavering. They would not surrender. They would not give up. For them, the war was far from over. By August 1945, the war had taken a decisive turn. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki devastated Japan, and the empire finally surrendered to the Allied forces. The war that had ravaged nations and claimed millions of lives had come to an end. The world was moving on, beginning the painful process of rebuilding. But deep in the jungle of Lubang Island, Onoda and his men knew none of this. They continued to carry out guerrilla operations, raiding local farms for supplies and engaging in skirmishes with Filipino police forces. To them, the war was still ongoing, and every attempt to tell them otherwise was seen as a trick by the enemy. Throughout 1945 and the years that followed, Allied planes dropped leaflets over the jungle, announcing Japan's surrender and urging any remaining soldiers to come out of hiding. The leaflets were filled with details that would have convinced most people. They described the defeat of Japan, the new government, and even the words of Emperor Hirohito himself. But for Onoda and his men, this was nothing more than enemy propaganda. They dismissed the leaflets as clever lies meant to break their resolve. After all, how could Japan, once an unstoppable force, have been defeated so thoroughly? How could their emperor have surrendered? Onoda, now a lieutenant, had been trained in intelligence. He knew deception when he saw it, or so he thought. Life in the jungle was harsh and unforgiving. Onoda and his companions survived by hunting animals, gathering wild fruits, and stealing food from local farmers. Every day was a struggle. They lived off coconuts, bananas, and whatever small game they could catch. When their uniforms began to wear out, they patched them up as best as they could. Their rifles remained their constant companions, always ready for the next battle they believed would come. As months turned into years, Onoda and his men continued to wait for reinforcements. They kept watch, hoping that one day they would see Japanese ships on the horizon, bringing fresh troops and supplies. But no reinforcements ever came. The group began to shrink. After 5 long years of isolation, in 1949, Private Akatsu, disillusioned and exhausted from jungle life, decided to leave. He quietly slipped away one night and surrendered to Filipino forces. His defection did nothing to change Onoda's resolve. Instead, it made him even more cautious, convinced that anyone who surrendered had been captured or brainwashed by the enemy. In 1954, after nearly a decade in the jungle, tragedy struck the group. During a skirmish with a Filipino search party, Corporal Shimada was killed. Onoda and Kazuka buried their comrade and carried on. Now just the two of them, continuing their lonely fight. The jungle grew more silent with each passing year. The world outside moved on, but for Onoda and Kazuka, time had stopped in 1945. They still believed they were carrying out their orders, protecting the honor of their homeland. For another 18 years, the two men waged a ghostly war. In 1972, during another raid, Kazuka was shot and killed by local police. His death left Onoda completely alone. It was a devastating blow, but even then, Onoda would not surrender. Now utterly isolated, he continued to carry out his mission, living as a lone soldier in the jungle, still loyal to an empire that no longer existed. By the early 1970s, news of Japanese holdouts still hiding in the jungles of the Pacific was becoming a distant memory. Yet Onoda's name had not been forgotten. A young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki, on a quest to find Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, set out for Lubang Island in 1974. Against all odds, Suzuki succeeded where others had failed. Suzuki tried to convince Onoda that the war had ended decades ago, but Onoda refused to believe him. He was still a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, and he would not surrender unless his commanding officer personally ordered him to do so. Suzuki returned to Japan with this extraordinary news, and the Japanese government immediately took action. They located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer, who had long since retired and was living as a civilian. Taniguchi agreed to travel to Lubang to formally relieve Onoda of his duty. On March 9, 1974, nearly 30 years after World War II had ended, Major Taniguchi stood before Onoda in the Lubang jungle. The major delivered the order Onoda had waited decades to hear. The war was over, and he was to stand down. At last, Onoda accepted the truth. Dressed in his old, tattered uniform, still armed with his rifle and ceremonial sword, Hiroo Onoda formally surrendered. He handed over his rifle, which was still in working condition, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition and several hand grenades. His uniform, though worn from years in the jungle, had been meticulously maintained. In his heart, he had never stopped being a soldier. Onoda's return to Japan was met with a mix of fascination, admiration, and disbelief. Some saw him as a hero, an embodiment of duty and loyalty to his country. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a man trapped in a war that had long since ended. Despite his involvement in raids that had resulted in the deaths of several Filipino villagers, the Philippine government granted him a pardon, understanding that he had genuinely believed he was still fighting a war. After returning to Japan, Onoda struggled to adjust to the modern world. The Japan he had once known no longer existed. Disillusioned, he eventually moved to Brazil, where he lived a quiet life as a cattle rancher. However, he remained connected to Japan, occasionally returning to give lectures, especially to youth groups, about perseverance, discipline, and loyalty. In 1996, Onoda returned to Lubang Island to make amends for the pain he had caused. He donated $10,000 to the local school, a gesture of goodwill to the community that had once been the enemy in his eyes. Onoda passed away in 2014 at the age of 91, leaving behind a legacy that is both extraordinary and haunting. His story of endurance, survival, and an unyielding sense of duty continues to captivate the world, reminding us of the profound and often tragic consequences of war. Thank you for watching this video. Hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more interesting videos.